Pam Bondi had always been known for her calm strength. She didn't talk too much, but when she did, people listened. Her voice carried both kindness and power, the kind that made others stop and think. She had built her name with hard work, long nights, and honest dedication. Most people in her city respected her, not just because of her position, but because she cared. She listened when people talked about their problems. She showed up when no one else did, and she never used her job to feel above others. But sometimes life has a strange way of turning against even the kindest people. It started on a warm afternoon. Pam was invited to speak at a local community event. The goal was simple: to bring people together to talk about change and to remind everyone that kindness still mattered. She wore a light blue dress and carried her notes neatly folded in her hand. Before stepping on stage, she smiled at a few people standing near the front row. Some waved back warmly, but others just stared, whispering among themselves. She tried not to notice, thinking maybe they were just distracted or curious. When she began speaking, her voice was steady. She talked about hope, about how people could make their city stronger by standing together instead of dividing each other. But just as she was about to share a personal story, a voice from the crowd shouted something harsh. At first, she didn't understand what was said. Then another person yelled again, louder this time, accusing her of things that weren't true. The words cut through the air like sharp glass. People nearby turned to see what was happening, and the peaceful atmosphere shifted in seconds. Pam froze for a moment, unsure what to do. She looked at the small group that had started shouting. Their faces were full of anger. Phones were lifted. People began recording. A few in the crowd tried to calm things down, but the shouting only grew louder. One man yelled insults that made others gasp. Pam felt her heart pounding inside her chest. She tried to keep her voice steady as she said, "Please, let's keep this respectful. I came here to talk about unity." But her words were drowned by noise. The camera lights flashed from different angles. Someone pushed forward to get a better shot, bumping into her shoulder. She nearly lost her balance. Security stepped in, but the moment was already captured. Pam standing there trying to stay composed while others hurled words at her like stones. Within minutes, someone uploaded the video online. By the time she got off stage, the clip had already started spreading. That night, she sat alone in her living room, watching the same short video replay again and again. The sound of shouting filled her home. The camera caught the way she flinched, the way she tried to smile through the humiliation. But online, the story looked different. Headlines called it, "Pam Bondi Confronted." Some posts twisted the situation, making it seem like she had done something wrong. Thousands of comments appeared, some supportive but many cruel. People who had never met her judged her within seconds. Pam's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Her friends sent messages of comfort, but even they seemed unsure what to say. "Don't worry about it," one text read. "It'll pass." But deep down, she knew it wouldn't pass that easily. She had seen what the internet could do, how fast people could turn, how quickly a small misunderstanding could destroy years of effort. The next morning, she walked into her office feeling the weight of 100 eyes. Some colleagues avoided looking at her. Others offered awkward smiles, pretending everything was fine. She thanked them and went straight to her desk. But she could feel it, the silence, the whispers, the judgment floating in the air. She opened her laptop and saw news channels replaying the clip. Reporters were giving opinions, some fair, some unfair. "Did Pam handle it right?" one anchor asked. "Should public figures be more accountable?" said another. No one mentioned the truth, that she had done nothing wrong, that she was the one who was shouted at, not the one who caused it. That evening, she skipped dinner and sat near the window, staring out at the quiet street below. She remembered her early days in law school, when she dreamed of making a difference. She had worked so hard to build a reputation based on honesty and courage. Now that reputation felt fragile. She wondered if people would ever see her the same way again. The thought made her chest tighten. She tried to remind herself that one bad moment didn't define her, but it was hard to believe that when the entire world seemed to be pointing fingers. Over the next few days, the noise didn't stop. More videos surfaced, edited in ways that made her look cold or defensive. Talk shows discussed her like she was a headline, not a person. Her social media was filled with cruel jokes and false claims. At one point, she thought about deleting everything, just disappearing from public view. But she couldn't. She had responsibilities, and walking away would only prove her critics right. Still, the idea of facing another day of judgment made her stomach ache. Her parents called, worried. Her mother's voice trembled when she said, "You didn't deserve that." Pam tried to sound strong, but her voice cracked when she replied, "I'll be fine." After hanging up, she sat quietly for a long time, letting the tears fall, not out of weakness but out of exhaustion. It was strange how one small moment, something so ordinary, could suddenly feel like the end of everything she had built. Days turned into weeks. The story started fading from the news, replaced by newer scandals and bigger headlines. But the damage lingered. Some people still whispered when she entered a room. A few even looked at her like she was someone else, someone they no longer trusted. Pam smiled politely, pretending not to notice, but each glance felt like another tiny cut. One morning, she decided to take a walk. She left her phone at home, put on a hat, and walked through the park. The air was crisp and the sky was painted with soft colors of dawn. For the first time in weeks, she felt a bit of peace. She watched a little girl feeding birds near the fountain. The child looked up and smiled at her, a pure, innocent smile, free from judgment. Pam smiled back, and in that small moment, something inside her softened. She realized how much she had been carrying. The shame, the anger, the disappointment. It was heavy, but it didn't have to define her. Later that day, she went back to work and found a letter waiting on her desk. It was from a woman she didn't know. The letter said, "I saw how they treated you that day. I know it must have hurt, but you stood tall and that meant something. I hope you know that some of us still believe in you." Pam held the paper close to her heart. It was such a small thing, a few kind words from a stranger, but it reminded her that not everyone had turned against her. She spent that evening rereading the letter. Then she took out a notebook she hadn't touched in years and started writing. Not statements or speeches, just her thoughts, her fears, her feelings. She wrote about how it felt to be misunderstood, how easy it was for people to forget that behind every headline was a human being. The writing helped her breathe again. It reminded her that she still had her voice, even if the world had tried to silence it. When she finished, she sat back and whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. Not yet." The words sounded strange at first, but slowly they began to feel real. She didn't know how she would fix things or if the world would ever see her the same way again. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't let that single painful moment define her story. In the weeks that followed, Pam began to change the way she looked at everything. The same people who had once laughed at her were now forgetting the incident altogether, moving on to other stories. But Pam didn't move on the same way. She carried the lesson with her, the understanding of how fragile reputation could be, how cruel public judgment could feel, and how easily kindness could be forgotten in the noise of the world. Still, she walked with her head high. Not out of pride, but because she refused to be broken by what happened. Somewhere deep inside her, she felt a quiet strength growing again, a strength she would soon learn to use not just for herself, but for something much greater. And though she didn't know it yet, this moment, the one that nearly destroyed her, was only the beginning of a far more powerful story waiting to unfold. The days after the incident slowly turned into months, but the sting of that day still stayed with Pam. Every time she heard her name mentioned in public, a wave of anxiety ran through her chest. Sometimes she would turn on the television and see her face flash across the screen, even if only for a moment, and it would all come back, the shouting, the judgment, the shame she tried so hard to hide at work. She carried herself with quiet professionalism. She still spoke calmly, handled her duties, and smiled politely when needed. But those closest to her could see that something inside her had changed. Her laughter, once warm and genuine, now came out faint and tired. She had always been strong, but now she seemed to live behind a thin wall, polite, careful, and distant. She used to walk into meetings with a sense of confidence, knowing exactly what she wanted to say. But now she hesitated before speaking, afraid that any wrong word might turn into another headline. That fear didn't come from weakness. It came from experience. Once you've been publicly judged, you never forget how quickly people can turn against you. At night, her home was quiet. Too quiet. The TV flickered in the background, playing the same kind of news shows that once admired her but now ignored her completely. She would make herself tea and sit on the couch, scrolling through messages on her phone. Most were work-related, some were friendly, but every so often she'd see a cruel comment pop up on an old post. Even though the controversy had faded, the internet never really forgot. And neither did she. One weekend she decided to drive out of the city. The open road always helped her think. She rolled down the windows, let the wind touch her face, and tried to breathe freely for the first time in weeks. She drove without any plan, passing fields, gas stations, and small towns she'd never visited before. Eventually, she stopped at a small diner on the side of the road. It was quiet inside, the kind of place where the smell of coffee fills the air. An older waitress smiled at her and said, "Haven't seen you around before." Pam smiled back politely and said, "Just passing through." The woman nodded and handed her a menu. For a while, Pam sat there in peace, just watching families and travelers come and go. No one recognized her here. No one whispered. It felt like a small piece of normal life again. When she finished eating, she paid the bill and stepped outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft colors. She stood there for a long moment, thinking about how different life felt when you were away from the noise. She realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about her mistake, or the video, or what people said. She was just there, and that quiet moment of peace made her realize how badly she needed to heal. Not just from the humiliation, but from the constant pressure of being perfect. When she returned home that night, she looked around her apartment. Everything was neat and organized, but it felt empty. She had built a strong life, but she had filled it with too much duty and too little joy. She decided to start changing that. She began reading again, books she used to love but had abandoned years ago. She took morning walks before sunrise, listening to the birds and watching the sky slowly brighten. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a tiny spark of herself returning. But healing is never simple. Some mornings she woke up feeling ready to face the world, and others she could barely get out of bed. One night, as she was preparing for sleep, she received a message from a former colleague. It said, "I know things have been rough, but don't let one bad chapter define your whole story." She read it twice, smiled faintly, and whispered to herself, "I won't." Still, there were hard days. One afternoon, while walking into a local store, she overheard two people whispering about her. They didn't mean for her to hear, but she did. The words weren't cruel, but they carried judgment, quiet, subtle, and heavy. Pam kept walking, pretending not to notice, but inside she felt a familiar ache. It wasn't the insult that hurt. It was the reminder that people still saw her as the woman from that video, not the person she really was. That night, she sat at her desk and pulled out her old notebook again, the one she had started writing in after reading that kind letter. She began writing about the pressure of public life, about how one mistake can erase years of effort. Her words came out slow at first, then faster. She didn't plan to show anyone what she wrote. It was just for her. But the act of putting her feelings into words felt freeing. For the first time, she could look at her pain without letting it define her. As weeks passed, she started going to small community meetings again. She didn't speak at first, she just listened. People were surprised to see her, but she stayed calm, polite, and kind. Slowly, the tension began to fade. Some people even came up afterward to shake her hand, saying, "Good to see you again." It wasn't much, but it meant everything. One evening, as she was leaving one of these gatherings, a young woman approached her. She couldn't have been more than 20. She looked nervous but determined. "Ms. Bondi," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. I saw how you were treated back then, and it made me realize how unfair people can be. But seeing you here tonight, it gives me hope." Pam smiled warmly and asked her name. The girl explained that she was studying law, hoping to one day work in public service just like Pam once did. Pam listened carefully, then said, "Don't let fear stop you. The world can be cruel, but it also remembers courage. Just be honest and never forget who you are." The girl nodded, her eyes shining. That small encounter stayed with Pam long after she got home. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that girl's words, and it gives me hope. For so long, Pam had been focused on what she lost. She hadn't realized how much she still gave. Her silence, her strength, even her ability to stand up after being broken, all of it mattered to someone. And that realization changed everything. The next morning, she sat by her window with a cup of coffee and looked out at the world below. Cars passed, people hurried to work, the city buzzed with life. For the first time in months, she didn't feel trapped by her past. She felt connected to something larger, to the quiet strength that lives in everyone who refuses to give up. She decided then that she would no longer hide. She would use what happened to her as a lesson, not of defeat but of survival. She started writing short reflections online, sharing thoughts about resilience, forgiveness, and the value of standing tall even when life knocks you down. At first, only a few people noticed, but slowly her words began to reach others. People commented things like, "This helped me today," or "I really needed to hear that." Her message was simple, that pain doesn't have to be the end, that everyone falls, but strength is found in how we rise again. And the more she wrote, the lighter she felt. She wasn't just healing herself anymore. She was helping others heal too. By the end of that year, Pam felt more like herself again, maybe even stronger than before. The old scars were still there, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they reminded her of how far she'd come. Every cruel word she'd once read online now seemed smaller compared to the quiet respect she earned back through her kindness and grace. One evening, as she walked home from her office, the city lights glowing around her, she thought back to that terrible day months ago. The shouting, the cameras, the humiliation. It felt like a lifetime ago now. She realized that moment, as painful as it was, had forced her to grow in ways she never imagined. It had taught her humility, patience, and above all, compassion, not just for others but for herself. And though she didn't know it yet, this slow return, this quiet rebuilding of her confidence, was setting the stage for something even greater. Because soon Pam would be given another chance to speak. Not as a victim, not as someone seeking redemption, but as a woman who had faced the storm and learned how to stand stronger than before. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning to rise again, this time not from power or position, but from the simple human courage to start over. Pam woke up early one morning with a strange sense of calm. The sunlight slipped through her curtains, warming the edge of her bed, and for the first time in months she didn't feel the heavy weight in her chest. She got up slowly, made herself coffee, and sat by the window watching the quiet street outside. Something felt different. She couldn't explain it, but deep inside she knew she was ready to start again. Not just to live, but to move forward. In the weeks that followed, Pam began saying yes to small invitations she had once avoided. A local university asked her to speak to a group of law students. At first she hesitated. The old fear crept in. What if they judged her? What if someone brought up the past? But then she remembered that young woman she'd met, the one who said she gave her hope. Pam couldn't forget her words. So she accepted the invitation. The day of the event arrived. Pam stood in front of the mirror before leaving, adjusting her blazer, feeling her nerves stir. She wasn't afraid of speaking. She'd done that her entire career. But this felt different. This time, she wasn't standing as a public figure. She was standing as a woman who had been broken and was learning to rebuild herself. When she walked onto the stage, the students clapped politely. She looked around the room, so many young faces full of curiosity and ambition. She smiled, took a deep breath, and began. "I've made mistakes," she said softly. "I've faced days when I wanted to disappear. But I'm still here, and I want to tell you why." The room fell silent. Every word she spoke came from her heart. She didn't try to sound perfect. She spoke about the importance of courage, of being misunderstood, and how public life can be both a gift and a burden. She shared how easily a single moment can change everything, and how forgiveness, especially toward yourself, is the hardest lesson to learn. By the time she finished, the audience stood and clapped, not because she was powerful, but because she was honest. After the talk, several students came up to thank her. Some even shared their own struggles, their fears of failure, their stories of being misjudged. Pam listened patiently to each one, realizing that what she had been through had given her something valuable, the ability to connect deeply with others who had faced their own storms. That night, as she drove home, she felt lighter. It wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about purpose. For months she had been searching for something to hold on to, and now she found it. The strength to use her pain to help others. Over the next few months, she received more invitations. Some from universities, others from small community groups. She didn't say yes to everything, but she chose the ones where she felt her voice could make a difference. Each time she spoke, she grew a little stronger. Her words began to travel further than she expected. People started to see her again, not as the woman from that video, but as someone who refused to give up. Still, not everyone was supportive. There were moments when critics tried to drag her name back into old controversies. Some online posts resurfaced, twisting her intentions, mocking her speeches. At first, she felt that familiar sting again. But instead of hiding, she stayed calm. She had learned that silence sometimes speaks louder than defense, and in time, those voices faded too. Her story began to inspire more people than she realized. One evening, she received a handwritten letter from a man who had lost his job after being unfairly blamed for a mistake he didn't make. He wrote, "Watching how you stood back up gave me strength to face my own battle." Pam read the letter twice, tears filling her eyes. She knew then that every painful step she had walked through had meaning, but there was one invitation that would change everything for her. It came from a national leadership organization that hosted an annual conference for women in public service. They wanted her to be one of the keynote speakers. The event would be broadcast nationwide. Pam stared at the email for a long time. Part of her wanted to say no. It was one thing to speak to small groups, but another to stand on a national stage again. The thought of facing millions of viewers, cameras, and critics made her heart race. For days, she wrestled with the decision. She went for long walks, trying to listen to her own thoughts. Every time she looked in the mirror, she asked herself, "Am I ready?" One evening, as she sat at her desk, she opened her old notebook again. She flipped through the pages filled with her handwriting. The pain, the confusion, the slow healing. Near the end, she found a line she had written months ago. "This isn't the end." Not yet, she smiled. Maybe now it really wasn't. She wrote back to the organizers and said yes. The weeks before the event passed quickly. She worked on her speech carefully, but she didn't rehearse it too much. She wanted it to sound natural, honest, real. The night before, she barely slept. She thought about how far she had come, from that day of humiliation to this moment of strength. When the day finally arrived, the conference hall was full. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Pam sat backstage waiting for her turn. She could hear the crowd clapping for the previous speaker. Her palms were slightly sweaty, but her heart was calm. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for perfection, but for peace. When her name was announced, the lights hit the stage as she walked forward. The applause was polite at first. She stood at the podium, looked around, and for a brief moment she saw the faces, hundreds of them, some curious, some skeptical. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She didn't start with her achievements or her career. She began with her story, the pain, the public judgment, the loneliness. She spoke about how easy it is for people to forget that leaders are human too, how one mistake can make the world forget every good thing you've done. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but as she continued, it grew stronger. She told them about the night she almost gave up, and the moment a stranger's kind letter gave her the courage to keep going. As she spoke, the room grew completely silent. Every person listened, not to a politician, but to a woman who had been broken and rebuilt herself piece by piece. She ended her speech by saying, "You can take away someone's title, you can take away their position, but you can never take away their heart. True strength is not in what you have, it's in what you survive." For a moment after she finished, there was silence. Then the entire room stood and clapped. It wasn't just applause, and it was a wave of emotion. People wiped tears from their eyes. Some held hands. Even those who had come with doubts stood in respect. After she stepped off the stage, several women came up to her backstage, thanking her for her words. One said, "You reminded me that I'm more than my failures." Another whispered, "You made me believe again." Pam smiled at them all, her eyes warm and kind. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt free. That evening, her speech began to spread across social media. But this time it wasn't twisted or mocked. People shared it with words like inspiring, powerful, and real. News outlets picked it up, calling it one of the most moving speeches of the year. But Pam didn't focus on the attention. What mattered to her was knowing that her story had finally turned into something good, something that helped others heal. When she got home that night, she sat quietly in her living room, the same place where she had once watched her world fall apart. But now it felt different. The same walls that once felt cold now felt safe again. She thought about how life had taken her through fire, but instead of burning her, it had shaped her. Before going to bed, she looked at herself in the mirror and whispered, "You made it." It wasn't pride, it was peace. She no longer needed to prove anything. She had already done the hardest thing anyone can do. She had forgiven herself and found her strength again. What she didn't know was that this speech would open new doors for her. People from across the country would soon reach out, inviting her to lead new projects and initiatives. Her voice, the same voice that had once been silenced by judgment, was now being heard in places it never had before. Pam didn't chase that success. She simply followed her purpose, because now she understood something she never truly did before. Power doesn't come from position or recognition. Real power comes from grace, from how you rise after falling, and from how you treat others even when the world hasn't treated you kindly. And as she turned off the light that night, a quiet smile stayed on her face. The woman who once felt broken had finally remembered who she was, and she knew this was just the beginning of the next chapter of her story. After her speech at the conference, life began to shift in quiet but powerful ways. Pam didn't expect it, and she didn't chase it either. She just kept showing up, speaking from her heart and letting her truth guide her. But word travels fast, and soon people began to see her differently. Those who had once criticized her now watched her with a new kind of respect. The same media that had once questioned her integrity now called her a voice of strength. Still, Pam stayed humble. She knew how quickly fame could change people. She had seen it before, how applause can turn into silence, how admiration can vanish overnight. So she kept her focus on what mattered most, connecting with people. Whether it was a student, a community member, or someone writing to her online, she made time to listen. Her replies were often simple but filled with warmth, the kind that reminded others that she truly cared. One morning, while sipping coffee on her porch, she received a call from a close friend who worked in government leadership. "Pam," the voice said, "there's an upcoming national forum on justice reform. They want you to speak. It's a big one, and the president will be there." Pam froze. It wasn't just any event. It was one of the most watched political gatherings in the country. Her first thought was to refuse. "I don't think I'm the right person," she said quietly. But her friend laughed gently and replied, "You're exactly the right person. People trust you. They need to hear your story." After the call, she sat still for a long time, staring at the cup in her hand. Part of her wanted to run from the opportunity. The idea of standing before national leaders, journalists, and the president himself was overwhelming. She wasn't sure she was ready for that level of attention again. But another part of her, the same quiet courage that had carried her this far, whispered that she couldn't turn away. That night, she thought about everything she'd been through. The public humiliation, the years of silence, the rebuilding of her confidence. Each painful step had shaped her into the person she was now. Maybe this was the reason for all of it. Not to destroy her, but to prepare her. By morning, her decision was made. She called back and said yes. The weeks leading up to the forum were filled with planning and preparation. She wrote her speech late into the night, carefully choosing each word. But she didn't want to sound rehearsed. She wanted to speak like she always had, from the heart with honesty. Some of her advisors suggested adding strong political points or statistics to impress the crowd, but Pam gently refused. "I'm not here to impress," she said softly. "I'm here to remind them we're all human." When the day arrived, the city buzzed with energy. Reporters crowded outside the venue, cameras flashing, microphones ready. Pam stepped out of the car wearing a calm expression, even though her heart was racing. The air was filled with chatter and clicking cameras, but she kept walking steadily toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was grand. Tall lights, elegant banners, and rows of chairs filled with the country's most powerful people. Pam was guided backstage, where she could hear the sound of the current speaker's voice echoing through the hall. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. She wasn't nervous anymore, not the way she used to be. She felt ready. When it was finally her turn, her name was announced with a soft applause. She walked up the steps and stood behind the podium. The bright lights shone down, and for a moment she saw familiar faces. Senators, judges, advocates, and even the president sitting in the front row. Pam began slowly, her voice steady but warm. "I stand here today not as someone who has always had power, but as someone who once lost it. I felt the pain of judgment, the sting of unfairness, and the silence that comes after public shame." The audience listened intently. You could feel the air grow still. "But I also learned something," she continued, "that real strength doesn't come from titles or applause. It comes from standing tall when everything around you tries to pull you down." As she spoke, people leaned forward, captivated. There was something in her tone. Not anger, not pride, but sincerity. She talked about forgiveness, resilience, and the need for compassion in leadership. She shared how every mistake, every fall could become a lesson if we allow it. Her words weren't fancy, but they were powerful because they were true. Halfway through her speech, Pam glanced briefly toward the president. He nodded, listening closely. That small gesture filled her with quiet confidence. She went on to talk about justice, not just the kind written in laws, but the kind shown through humanity. We talk about justice as something that belongs in courtrooms, she said, but it begins in our hearts. It's how we treat people when no one's watching. It's how we respond when someone stumbles. When she finished, there was silence again, that kind of silence that comes right before something big. Then the entire hall stood and applauded. It wasn't just polite clapping this time. It was long, heartfelt, and thunderous. Pam smiled gently, not in pride but in peace. She had said what she needed to say. After she left the stage, several people came to greet her. Reporters wanted interviews, politicians wanted photos, and even the president approached her with a kind smile, saying, "That was one of the most honest speeches I've heard in a long time." Pam thanked him graciously. But what touched her most wasn't the attention. It was the people who came quietly afterward. A staff member who had been struggling with burnout whispered, "You gave me strength today." Another young woman on the verge of tears said, "You reminded me that kindness still has power." That night, as Pam sat in her hotel room, she turned on the television. Her speech was already being replayed on major networks. For a moment, she just watched silently. She didn't feel the excitement of fame or the fear of criticism, just gratitude. The same woman who once sat alone in her living room, broken by public ridicule, was now being celebrated for her courage and grace. Life truly had come full circle. In the following days, messages poured in from across the country. People shared how her words had touched them. Veterans, single mothers, teachers, and even students. Some said they had felt invisible until they heard her speak. Others said she helped them believe that they could rebuild their lives too. Pam read every message she could, smiling softly at each one. She didn't see herself as a hero. She was just someone who had learned to keep her heart open, even when the world tried to close it. Soon she was invited to join a national committee focused on community leadership and justice reform. The role wasn't about politics, it was about people. Pam accepted without hesitation. She wanted to make a real difference, not just through speeches, but through actions that could help others find their strength too. The months that followed were busy, but fulfilling. Pam traveled across the country, visiting schools, meeting community leaders, and listening to everyday people share their struggles. Each story reminded her of why she started speaking again in the first place. She didn't want to lead from power. She wanted to lead from empathy. One afternoon, she visited a small town that had faced years of hardship. The local community center was nearly empty when she arrived, but by evening, the place was full. People came not because she was famous, but because they believed she understood them. She didn't stand on a big stage or use a microphone that day. She sat in a circle with them, talking and listening like equals. Some shared stories of loss, others of hope. When one man said he felt forgotten by the system, Pam placed her hand gently on his and said, "You're not forgotten. Sometimes change begins with one person who refuses to give up." That moment summed up everything she had learned. Leadership wasn't about being above others. It was about walking beside them. As time went on, Pam's influence continued to grow, but she never let it change her heart. She remained the same soft-spoken woman who once stood on a stage, trembling but brave, sharing her truth. Whenever people praised her, she would simply say, "I just told my story. That's all." But deep inside, she knew her story had become more than hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, everyone who had fallen and found a way to rise again. On a quiet night months later, Pam stood by her window, looking out at the city lights. The world outside seemed calm and bright. She thought about the journey, the pain, the loss, the rediscovery. None of it had been easy, but every part of it had meaning. And as she stood there, she realized something profound. Power isn't given. It's earned through grace, through patience, through choosing kindness when the world gives you every reason not to. Pam smiled, whispering softly, "This is what power really means." She wasn't thinking of political power or fame. She was thinking of the quiet strength that comes from survival, the power to forgive, to heal, and to lead with compassion. That was her real victory, not the applause, not the headlines, but the peace in her heart. And though she didn't yet know what the next chapter would bring, she was ready. Because this time, whatever came her way, she knew she had already found her greatest strength in herself.